Hello and welcome to Daily Dose Radio, a 5-minute-a-day podcast studying the Psalms verse by verse, recorded here in the dining room of the Bible Bistro, located in Sharonville, Ohio. Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Daily Dose Radio here in the Bible Bistro. So glad you've joined me today for this third remembrance, part 3 we're going to call this, of the psalmist Asaph remembering what God has done. We started over there in verse 43, how he had wrought his signs in Egypt. And he goes through the signs, the Egyptian signs, and then in 51 through 58, actually 50 through 55, he continues remembering the signs, and then he remembers how they acted. And it's very much like what we had over here in 36 through 38 and 40 through 42. You know, they're acting in a certain way. They're acting out their corruption. They're acting out their own actual sins, choosing to worship false gods rather than to follow the commands of God and worship Him. So that's a problem. And then we come today to 59 through 64, and we're going to have Remembrance Part 3. We're going to hear about God's judgment. And we start off with a very curious statement here. Let me read the passage, and then I'll make my comment there. When God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh and the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. So here we have the Remembrance Part 3, when God heard this. That's the curious thing, I think, that I want to point out. It's not that he saw this. It wasn't that he saw them turning back, but he heard them turning back. He heard them tempting him. He heard them provoking him. He heard them dealing unfaithfully like their fathers. He heard the provocation, you see. They provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy. And when God heard this, he's listening to us all the time. He's listening. And he hears their provocation. And when he heard this, he was angry. Now, does he have a right to be angry? Sure he does. Is he justified? Absolutely. He's the great judge of all the earth. He's justified in whatever he decides to do. But he's certainly justified here, isn't he? Because remember, he being full of compassion forgave their iniquity. And then we have all that he did for them. They've forgotten it, but he doesn't. The psalmist hasn't forgotten it. He redeemed them from Egypt. He brought them into the land. He gave them an inheritance and set it down by line and lot. And yet they still provoked him. So when God heard this, he was angry. He was wroth, greatly abhorred Israel. So that, now we're going to have some more history here, he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men. The tabernacle of Shiloh and the tent he placed among men, and then the next verse 61, and delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hand, is 1 Samuel chapter 4. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, carried the ark into battle, and because of their great sin and the corruption, the Lord judges them. The ark is carried off by the Philistines into their camp and eventually into their cities. And you can read all about that beginning there in 1 Samuel chapter 4. So this is remembering God's judgment. And he judges the tabernacle. It's never again, never after the tabernacle the ark is taken, that tabernacle just fades into obscurity, really. And he delivered his strength into captivity, his glory into the enemy's hand. That's the ark. 62, he gave his people over also under the sword and was wroth with his inheritance. Fire consumed their young men. Their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword. There's Hophni and Phinehas falling by the sword. And of course, Eli, was judged then as well. Their widows made no lamentation. Well, what did their widows do? Well, you can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 19 through 22. What their widows did was, Well, at least Phinehas's wife, she was giving birth. She died in childbirth and named the baby Ichabod, saying that the glory had departed. So there was no tears. There was only a painful recognition of what God had done. All right, so join me again tomorrow, and we will look at the final passage, beginning in verse 65, going to verse 72, here on Daily Dose Radio. Thanks for listening to Daily Dose Radio. For more fresh and delicious Bible studies, podcasts, books, and more, check out the Bible Bistro online and on YouTube. Join me again next time for Daily Dose Radio.